Just going to give people a few seconds to join. Make sure that everyone is here and present before we start. Okay. Hopefully everyone has joined. I see we have 73 viewers, so that's great. Thank you so much for coming. Welcome. Just in case you are unsure where you are, this is the Black Homeownership Network Strategy Update, and we are going to be talking today with three really great speakers who've been integrally involved in the work of creating a strategy, sort of a strategic plan for how. Hopefully everyone is joined. I see we have how we as community partners and collaborators can work together to increase the number of Black homeowners in the Puget Sound area in the next several years. My name is Denise Rodriguez. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Homeownership Resource Center. We are one of the many partners that have been involved in this work. Since I believe the first meeting was March 29th. Since that, we've had 3 large group convenings, and then we've had several different work groups focused on different elements of a productive home buyer and home ownership strategy. We've had a group focused on land acquisition and construction lending. We've had a group focused on home buyer identification and preparation and sustaining existing homeowners. We've had a group focused on policy and also a group focused on mortgage lending. And those groups have met independently and then come together on those 3 separate occasions. And what you're going to learn about today is the product of that effort. And I'm really grateful to have had the opportunity to work so closely with these 3 excellent speakers, all of whom have generously volunteered to speak to you today and introduce this plan and talk about the work. So first, I am going to introduce Darryl Smith. He is the Executive Director of HomeSight. We also are joined by Patience Malaba, who is the Director of Government Relations and Policy with the Housing Development Consortium of Seattle-King County. And then we have Carla Moreira Strickland, who is Vice President of Corporate Responsibility with JP Morgan Chase. With that, I am going to turn things over to our first speaker. I will be monitoring the chat during the session. If we have time for questions at the end of the session, I will surface those for the speakers, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. So please do put your questions in the chat. I will be monitoring there. And we'll also put a link to the plan in the chat in case you are interested in going and viewing that and having it handy for later. So with that, thank you very much. I believe Darryl is our first speaker, so take it away, Darryl.
Thank you, Denise. It's great to partner with you in this work, and thank you all for joining this session. I appreciate your presence here in this really important discussion. We're anxious to detail for many of you what we've been working on these last few months. But I thought it would be important to sort of start out with some context. And so the image you see here on the left of your screen is a woman by the name of Josie Stewart. Josie Stewart was my great-grandmother. And in this undated photo that was found in my grandmother's belongings after she died in the South Bronx in the early 1980s, we recovered this photo, which we assume is my great-grandmother looking beautiful and powerful and brilliant in front of her own home. We know it's her own home because the image on the left, rather on the right that you see in blue, is the handwritten plat map that was also recovered from my grandmother's things. And this beautifully written plat map details the fact that Josie Stewart was in ownership of property, lots 21 through 26, extending all the way back to Baptist Street, which you can barely make out in the upper left-hand corner. All of those contiguous lots, a full city block in the city of Greenwood, South Carolina in 1921 was owned by my great-grandmother, Josie Stewart. At some point or another in my family's history, this property came out of our ownership. we no longer own this property. I was able to do some title search work on this probably about 2008 or 9 before I had this framed for my mother's 80th birthday. And the title search revealed that there was no history beyond about 1970. There was decades that were lost to our family in terms of what happened with this property. Perhaps it was sold under value. Perhaps it was stolen. We just simply don't know. What we do know is that the generational wealth that should have been attributed to this property up from my great-grandmother, Josie Stewart, who my mother, Josie Carter Smith, is named for, didn't go to my grandmother, Gladys. It didn't go to my mother, Josie. It didn't go to me, and it didn't go to my daughter, Sophia. And so the question we have for ourselves as a family is, what happened? And the question I have is, how many other stories across the United States are reflective of my own family's history? All we have left is the photo and the plat map. We don't have that generational wealth. My mother, through her own sheer determination and brilliance, along with my father, had to help chart my future, which was not easy. It's a whole nother story for another conversation. But the point here is, how do we continue to make strides in correcting a historical wrong that happened to my family and perhaps thousands upon thousands of other families across the country? And as we move to the next slide, let's bring this forward and let's figure out what the stories are behind some of the numbers and the stats that I'd like to share with you. Here in Puget Sound, ownership versus renting rates by race. We can see here that, again, we see this story of Black families that rent versus own is lagging in nearly every category. The next slide shows us that home ownership rates, even by income level, all the way up the ladder, show that there's a lag, there's a dearth, something is missing here. How many of these stories behind these stats are similar to my own family's, where that lack of capital, that lack of generational wealth building denied of opportunity for families to build for their futures? And when we take a look at the final slide here, before I share a couple of thoughts with you, we can see nationally how stark this is. This shows us the racial wealth gap in the United States from about 1992 to 2016. And we can see the line across the bottom there. The gap is staggering. It's absolutely staggering, abysmal, and frankly, it's based, in my view, on evil policies. This is reflective of why homeownership rates lack in the Black community. A lot of it, I suspect, goes directly back to stories like my own family story. We can throw in some redlining there and some evil practices that clearly helped opportunity or denied opportunity to happen for so many families. Some updated numbers I can share with you. Seattle, Tacoma, Bellevue area, the Black home ownership rate right now sits at about 29%. For white counterparts in the community, it's at 65% with a 36% gap. The Black homeownership gap relative to whites is about a 16-point percentage gap. In the state of Washington, Black homeownership sits at 31%, whereas it's at 68% for our white counterparts. And the change from 2018 to 2019 in terms of that gap is 2.5% in terms of value. So we know these numbers, we've heard these numbers over and over again, and we can dig in and slice and dice it any number of ways. But in my view, it's really that heart connection, that story connection behind the numbers that really belie some of the challenges that many of us on this call and in this room are working on to try to correct. And it's really, really hard work. So I want to introduce a colleague who's been such a champion and such a great partner to work with in this strategy that we've been working on for several months now. Patience Malaba is a font of knowledge and wisdom around some of these issues and really helps many of us at a staff level track issues, both in terms of advocacy and also just cobbling together and bringing together the strategies that are really going to be necessary for all of us to truly move the needle. Not just for my family, but for countless families across the state of Washington, and certainly concentrated right here in Puget Sound. So Patience, why don't you tell folks about what our strategies have been?
Thank you, Darryl, and thank you for that grounding reminder of your personal family story and the plummeting Black homeownership rates numbers. Your story is a part of a larger community story that has led us to this very day. Story after story, study after study, community voices have made it clear that people of color cannot access equitable pathways to opportunity, including intergenerational wealth creation, as you just shared, due to really systematic policies that are limiting for folks and practices. And in many respects, the inequities remain stuck and they have been further exacerbated. The ongoing crisis that we are in right now with the pandemic, with housing, with equity, has shed, I believe, a renewed light on the barriers to wealth creation, especially for communities of color. As such, in March of this year, working with the Coalition for More Housing Choices, alongside the Washington Roundtable, the Bankers Association, the Washington Homeownership Resource Center, and HDC, we convened stakeholders to explore the creation of a challenge statement that will get us to a place to work on a specific initiative and work on that initiative as a network where our success is not determined by just the work of one institution, but all of us collectively can get to a point of impact. Next slide, please. Together, we agreed on an aspiration to get to a place where we are closing the Black-white home ownership gap. And we were very intentional in looking at our approach, really grounding it on a targeted universalism approach, where we're looking at the folks who are most disproportionately currently impacted, knowing that if we uplift those, we're lifting all of us at the same time. So our challenge statement is looking at by 2041, increasing the Black home ownership in the Puget Sound region to be sufficient to close the Black-white home ownership gap. And I want to give some perspective to the numbers there in terms of what they look like. The Black population currently is about 60% of the Puget Sound region. And that translates to about 6% of 3.7 million people in the Puget Sound region. It's about 200,000 residents who are identifying as Black people. And their home ownership rates currently are at 30%. Compared to whites at 64%. And in order for us to really close the gap, we're going to need to produce 60,000 new homeowners within this timeline in order for us to get to a point where we're closing the gap. And this is with the assumption that the population doesn't grow. This is with the assumption that there are no changes in our market, which we all know will happen. So we're going to need to do even more than we have set ourselves up to do. So we committed to crafting a comprehensive strategic plan that can get us to a point where we work in joint partnership between the public, the private, the nonprofit to really close the Black home ownership and white home ownership gap. And as such, today we launch and release the 7-point plan. Next slide, please. The 7-point plan recognizes that in order for us to double the Black home ownership, we're going to need to do work that is comprehensive. It can simply be put sometimes as a supply and demand issue, but the challenge with that is it oversimplifies the complexity of what needs to change and the complexity of what needs to be amplified in order for us to be successful. So as such, we have narrowed our focus to 7 areas, working as a network to cover these specific strategies under each of the identified focus points. And I'm going to spend time highlighting what we have included under each one. Next slide, please. Each focus area has a strategic objective and also has strategic strategies under each one. And going beyond this day, we'll be working further on tactics and really defining what the actions will be. But so far, we have strategic objectives and strategies. And I do want to go into each one of them in order for you to get a sense of what we are looking at per focus area. Next slide, please. Looking at the marketing and outreach part, here we're aiming to overcome negative experiences that Black households have had to have within discriminatory practices that are really embedded in our systems in being able to access home ownership opportunities. We're looking at an objective of connecting with the Black population to assert an interest in home ownership and making sure that we're proactively sharing the potential opportunities that exist for them to access home ownership. In terms of some key strategies that I'm going to highlight and defer to you to go and read the full document, the first one is looking at creating a network of community-based organizations, faith leaders, community leaders who can really facilitate trusted connections with community. As many of you do know, the home buying process is about the folks around you that you can trust, that can advise you, that can provide you with support throughout the process to a point of success. So it's really looking at creating those networks that can facilitate necessary relationship building with Black households in order to get us to a place where people can be successful in wanting to be homeowners. The second strategy that I want to highlight is working with trusted brokers to really develop outreach tools and tactics that can be tailored and appropriate to the Black population. And I pause there to emphasize that the Black population is not a monolith. And it's important as we are approaching this from a targeted universalism place to really be strategic in terms of the specific tools that work for different populations to help them be successful. And that also includes looking at ways that our marketing becomes affirmative in being able to help folks understand the affordable home ownership products that are out there, the services and the resources that exist for them to tap into. And long-term, we're looking at working on the redefinition of the first-time home buyer so we can increase the uptake of first-time home buyer programs, and also long-term working at tracking folks who are taking home ownership classes with the Housing Finance Commission to be sure where they are, because sometimes folks can take a training for home ownership and really be scared by the process and not get the support necessary to help them stay on a path of being a yes and getting to holding the keys of a new home. So that's going to be part of the work that we're looking at. Next slide, please. The second focus area is looking at pre-purchase counseling. And here we are wanting to really provide ways, developing new and existing and expanding existing programs that are comprehensive to support people who are ready to buy a home, who are near ready, or who are not ready and need long-term strategies to be supported. And we'll be looking at developing systems of intake and assessment that can really triage tailored plans to really prepare people for success. The second strategic objective there looks at us moving beyond looking at home ownership as just an event, but rather recognizing that it's a process. And the strategy there really involves cultivating an ecosystem of collaboration with trusted brokers who can really get to a place where they make available resources like debt remediation programs that folks would need to cover some debt that they would have experienced from life events, credit programs that can really help them be successful in this home buying process. And ultimately, the people who are denied applications, and we know that Black households are denied the most, giving them a path to ultimately get to a pre-approval long-term is another key strategy that we're looking at the pre-purchase counseling aspect. Next slide, please. The third focus area is looking at purchase supports. It recognizes that as much as we can prepare people before they get into purchasing, it's important that we make available as many tools as possible once they are in the home buying process. And this is creating an array of tools that can really help them be successful by increasing the down payment assistance programs that are available out there, looking at expanding the use of home buyer clubs and some programs that can really help them have enough resources to not only put down a down payment, but also have closing costs. So we're looking at strategies that can advance that work. We're also looking at a strategy of designing and implementing a debt remediation revolving loan fund, because we all know that debt is one of the limiting aspects of being able to have access to that pre-approval letter. That's really the initiation of getting to home buying. So can we have a fund in place that can help folks be able to cover some of those historic experiences that can be limiting? The second strategic objective is looking at the point of increasing funding for down payment assistance and recognizing that the income levels here are not just the low income focus, but also the moderate income people who will not have access to certain programs and are really on the buffer zone. So it's important that we're increasing the funding of what available and including private and philanthropic partners to expand those resources and make them be available. And we're moving on to the fourth area here. The fourth focus area is on credit and lending. And here we're really looking at innovative strategies in mortgage credit scoring and also in mortgage products that can really be context responsive. I've seen mortgages that can be limiting for people in being able to access just because of their credit history, just because of the student debt that can also be limiting. So can we make available loan products that can really support folks in being able to access home ownership opportunities? And that looks at strategies specific to standardizing underwriting guidelines and providing uniform income and acquisition limits to increase down payment assistance utilization. It also looks at training for lending partners on how to use down payment assistance products, because sometimes down payment assistance programs are not offered upfront. So if the lenders are really trained to understand the products that are out there, it becomes far much more easier to help folks, whether it's low and moderate income, to be able to be successful in the home buying process. And I think the third one that I do want to emphasize as highlighted there as a key priority is looking at expanding the number of community-based lending professionals who work with community and really be responsive in different contexts and supporting folks across the finish line. Moving on to focus area 5. Focus area 5 looks at housing production. And it recognizes that as much as we can work on pre-purchase and outreach and the purchase tools being in place, we can set ourselves up to fail if we don't increase the supply of affordable homes or affordable options that are out there. And it's really looking at building the sector's capacity to increase and scale the delivery of homes that are needed. And the first strategy within that is looking at securing new resources for pre-development, which many of you who are developers truly understand that those soft dollars are a big gap that we have. So increasing the availability of pre-development funding and supporting operations and the staff capacity of nonprofit organizations who are community-based or who are community-focused. We all know that we can produce as many homes, but if we don't have the staff capacity that can really support people to get into those programs or build relationships with community, we cannot get to a place of success. The second strategic objective is looking at a comprehensive land identification, mapping, and acquisition initiative. And I cannot emphasize how important this is. I often emphasize a number of, with land, if we are making land available for affordable home ownership production, we're reducing the cost by an estimated 15%. So it's really important that we make the land available and we do so in the most strategic and comprehensive manner. So in terms of strategies here, we're looking at a due diligence of identifying underutilized land opportunities that exist out there, looking at surplus land from the public sector, looking at faith-owned land for affordable home ownership opportunities, and recognizing that with home ownership, sometimes it can be the remnants of land. We've seen this most recently in Seattle with the Sound Transit remnant properties that will be used for affordable home ownership. So it's really being intentional in terms of the strategies of acquiring the necessary land for affordable home ownership production. And then looking at the ways that we can accelerate the use of community ownership models in partnership with community-based organizations. There are classic examples of this work that we're seeing in Skyway currently with the partnership of Homestead alongside Skyway community partners, the ways that we can continue to advance such models in true examples within our communities. And 5C is looking at the production of a diverse array of homes, whether it's sizes, its types, its income levels. It's important that we have all homes that are available for different people from different incomes along the spectrum, and the identification of being a part of the Black population. And this looks at really increasing the investments of public subsidy, which is very important for us to get to a place where affordable home ownership is scaled and produced at a higher level. And then looking at the ways that we can continue to broaden the use of creative methods of affordable home ownership production. So that's looking at shared equity models, limited equity models, and other cooperatives that can get us to a place where access to home ownership does not become a barrier. And then moving on to focus area 6. Focus area 6 gets to policies and practices. And this is where really it's important for us to be intentional and comprehensive in terms of what we're advancing on this front. And here we're looking at a comprehensive look from the zoning and regulatory reform policies that can get us to a place where we can increase access to not only affordable home ownership opportunities, but also market rate home ownership opportunities that can really take off the pressure from the market. So the first strategy here is looking at the state level. Can we enable a robust zoning policy that can get us to a place where we're opening neighborhoods that have exclusively not been accessible, especially for BIPOC communities and Black households? And this must include the regulatory and financial incentives that can really help people have access to those opportunities once they are opened. And it means leading with those anti-displacement strategies in the zoning changes that local jurisdictions will be taking up. And beyond that, looking at the ways that processes like the design review really facilitate home ownership production or housing production overall. We know that in many jurisdictions, it's taking almost 18 months for a project to go through. Can we revise those time limits and get to a place where we're really producing homes with a sense of urgency that the moment is demanding of us? The second strategic objective there is continuing on building on the acquisition that's necessary for us to get to a place where we have more affordable homes and preserving the affordability that we have. Within that, we're looking at strategies like getting the housing benefit districts legislation, which we have been championing for some time now, a huge vision to get us to a place of scaling land acquisition across the finish line. This is legislation that has been reviewed at the state level, and it's about time in 2022 and 2023 to get us to a place where the legislation is in place. And there are other strategic objectives that you will not see here that are getting to a place where we're increasing grants for affordable home ownership production. And we're also finding ways to help people stay in place, because it's not just about producing more homes, but it's also sustaining those growing communities to be able to stay within their community. Next slide, please. For this final focus area, we're looking at sustaining existing homeowners, making sure that we're helping people not only stay within their homes, but also bear the fruit of wealth building opportunity that they have with home ownership. So we're looking at really a comprehensive post-purchase education, counseling, and resources that's necessary to be available to Black households in order for them to be able to stay in place. And the top tier priority strategy there is looking at the proactive outreach to Black homeowners and offering foreclosure prevention, especially now with the COVID-19 crisis that we've been in and with the loss of employment that people have had to experience, making those resources available. And beyond the crisis, making those resources available for people to be able to stay within their homes. The study after study that shows that especially middle income Black homeowners who are between 40 to 65 do tend to buy homes and still get back to the market and be renters. And that is because they would not have been given the necessary support to stay within their homes and bear the fruit of intergenerational wealth building. So we're looking at those tools, advance that. We were also wanting to ensure that there's sufficient education, sufficient funding, I apologize, for all facets of foreclosure prevention programs, which remains important and remains a huge gap. And I will not cover all the strategies here. I think I've emphasized how important it is for us to sustain homeowners. And I will close on this specific focus areas and strategies by offering gratitude to the partners who have been leading this work, to you, Darryl, and to you, Carla and Dennis, for your great work in pulling this point together, and to Mari Koistra at HDC, who has been phenomenal with his leadership in really championing this vision to a point where we have this plan released, and we're inviting all of you to work with us in getting to a point where we can be successful in getting to closing the Black home ownership gap with the white home ownership. With that, I'm inviting a true partner who has been a visionary with us along this journey, Carla Strickland, to take us on to calling us to action.
Thank you so much, Patience. And actually, before I kick off, I'm going to switch to Darryl, who has, I think, some inspirational words for us as well, and really helping us kick off this call to action. So Darryl.
Thank you, Carla. And, you know, Patience mentioned the gap, the gap we're talking about between Black households and white households here in the Puget Sound region. And I may have misspoke earlier, so I want to correct myself and say that the gap, unfortunately, is getting bigger. Between 2018 and 19, it grew by 2.5%. We suspect that continues that trend. So we need to all lean in and stop that trajectory. We want to stop that train in its tracks. And so let me point out a good news story. On the screen here is Marone. She's a staff member at HomeSight. I'm incredibly proud of her. Marone is standing on the porch of her home that she purchased. And I can say this because I don't have a lot of hair left. As a person who is younger than me, right, owns her own home, standing on her porch. And you can see from her beautiful smile that, you know, the future is in her hands for her family and her family beyond that, building that generational wealth. This is what we need to see more of here in the Puget Sound region. It's the right thing to do for our community. It's the right thing to do for the Black community specifically. And we need to take a really active hand. And I can't stress that enough. We can't let the barriers of the past, or, you know, we can't do this because. We have to get creative. We have to really be targeted. And we have to really mean what we say and create more happy and beautiful photos like the one we see here in front of us. That's what this is really all about. I'm called to this work for personal reasons and professional reasons. I'm incredibly proud to work on this with my colleagues in this space. It is so important and feels like this moment in our country's history is really calling all of us in this sector to take this work on, to take up the challenge. And so I'm really inviting everyone to join with us, to find your place in those strategies. Community is at the table. It's another important factor. We're not doing this in a vacuum. This is bringing together the folks indicated as partners, but all of us have direct connections to community. It's why we're doing this work, to have more photos like this one of Marone. So I really invite all of you to find your place, to get on this train, the right train, join this table. There's lots of chairs available, and we'd be happy to make sure you're connected. So Carla, there might be some specifics we could talk about. So I'll toss the baton to you.
That's right. Thank you, Darryl. As you all have heard, right, that if we were to completely close the Black-white homeownership rate in our region within the next 20 years, we're looking at about 3,000 potential new homeowners a year. And that's a huge goal and challenge for all of us. And I think what has become really clear as you've had public sector, nonprofit, and private sector partners coming around a table to facilitate this initiative is that it's going to require all of us to work collectively, to think creatively and strategically, and to align across our sectors to take action, right? And we need to keep it up, right? It can't necessarily be an insert here and there. It's thinking, how are we in this relationship for the long term, and identifying opportunities in the immediate term, in the medium term, and in the long term for us as institutions or as sectors to play a role in closing the Black-white homeownership rate in this region. And I think, as has been noted, and therefore likely facilitating equally and sizable systemic changes for all communities of color that are disproportionately impacted in our region and across the state. As a representative within the financial institution, the financial services space, while I sit within corporate responsibility and really am very closely connected to nonprofit partners and social impact work in the region, have been working with our partners across the firm to think about this, like how do we play a role in mitigating change or in catalyzing change moving forward. And patients went through this. So I do hope that everyone spent some time on this on your own as well, in terms of like what the challenge statements are and where some of the immediate strategies are that we'll be focusing on. But I'm assuming that all the FIs in the room can really clearly identify some of the work that you can immediately plug into. I think one of the things that I've come away with and have talked about a lot internally is this thought of homeownership as a process, not an event. Our nonprofit partners are working with community members for years, right? Building the relationships, thinking about all the different things that are needed in order to make homeownership a reality or in order to sustain their homeownership. And that requires a lot of trust building and requires, intentional relationship building. And it requires that sustained engagement that I think we certainly need to see within our sector and need to think about these things from that frame of mind of, it's not just an event and I'm not going to just be working with that individual in this short-term process. How can I connect different business units, connect with different partners, and think also, I think, beyond our walls. It's something that we've been really starting to think about here, especially. How do we go beyond our brick and mortar, right? To build trust, to understand community needs, to develop deeper relationships with community members and community organizations alike, and understand what are those gaps, those challenge points that we need to be better addressing in order to prioritize home buyers and homeowners of color. I feel like there are like these 3 or 4 areas that we can think about within the financial services, with credit unions, with funders, about how to engage with this work. There's that like immediate opportunity for breaking down walls and silos and identifying gaps that we can immediately solve. And so when Patience was going through the outreach section, what would it mean for us to implement affordable outreach strategies within our work? What would it mean for there to be, language access considerations included, and going to where community members are to provide information on our products and services and other ways that we could be supportive, widely sharing that information, right? What DPA, down payment assistance programs, are we not currently being vocal about with their clients, and how can we train staff to be able to speak to them? One thing that we focused a lot at JPMC this past year and a half is on our staffing model. So how can we create a different coverage model and incentive model for home lending advisors. And so this is a new role that has started to roll out across the country, but it's called a community home lending advisor. It basically changes the makeup of how you're incentivized to originate loans and support clients. It's a salary base. So it really sort of changes the dynamics where you are able to work with that customer for a longer and more sustained period of time. So thinking about those ways in which we can better facilitate our support in the community. Also, one of the things we hear often is around facilitating warm handoffs. If you're saying no, can it be a no? And, here are an array of resources and tools and organizations doing fantastic work in the community that can probably immediately help support you in your goals, and we'll be here down the road when you're ready to come back to us. And so really thinking holistically about the cycle of homeownership. We've talked a lot as well about, okay, if there isn't something that you can immediately tack or implement, a solution that you can't immediately implement, how can you partner or help augment the work of trust-based partners in the community? Today, we met with Darryl and his team at the Orenda and Othello, and just talking about the different products that they have available and tools to support customers that we may not have, right? So for instance, they have an ITIN product. Well, how can we support that even if it's outside of our home lending division? Same thing for in terms of cultivating a wider network of products and services that are available and sort of closing the gap between maybe nonprofit, public, and private. Where can private sector partners jump in and support the Washington Homeownership Resource Center and the portal that they have developed to expand it to include the products and services, the technical assistance that we have available within our institutions, that we just probably need to close the gap on that outreach and marketing and sort of awareness process. I think there's many of the longer term pieces that we've talked about, like how can we can immediately play a role in helping our nonprofit partners think through home buyer clubs and thinking about the sustainability of those types of initiatives, thinking about language access and underwriting. We've spent a lot of time talking about the available capital for affordable for sale construction financing. Where can we start to immediately play a role? Maybe it's not, in your line, in that development banking line of business, maybe it's coming from philanthropy units or it's coming from your impact finance teams. And so really thinking strategically about all of the resources that your financial institution may have to bear. And then what new products or services do you have, or should you be thinking about really to start closing some of these gaps? And then finally, I think the other pieces that we all have probably other colleagues that are working on different issues that could really play a role as well. So making sure that we're also bringing other voices within our institutions to really expand and augment this work. So for instance, I know that for me, I have a particular line of business that I oversee, but making sure that my home lending team is involved, right? That are immediately in charge of originating loans and refinancing loans, making sure that our government relations team can plug in, like really thinking about all the different ways in which your institution can support. And finally, just want to put a plug for our next convening. So our next summit is on Friday, November 5th. We'll also have ongoing work group meetings for the ones listed in the slide. If you would like to be added to our mailing list or would like to share any additional insights with us, please reach out to Emily, who is fantastic. We honestly, none of this could really happen without Emily either. So thank you so much, Emily. And we really hope that you think about a way, even if it's just joining us to hear what we're talking about at the next summit. But we need everyone on this in this meeting today to jump in and support and help make this into a reality. So thank you all for being with us this morning. And I'll turn it over to Denise.
Thank you so much, Carla and Darryl and Patience. Just so much great information. What a wonderful summary. It is amazing how many months we have spent working on it to have it so succinctly and clearly summed up in a 50-minute session today. So wonderful. Thank you. We do have a couple of questions that have come in through the chat. So we have a couple minutes and I will start off definitely just some folks expressing their appreciation for your time. One question we got, said, and this is for any of the speakers who feels up to fielding this question. If we are looking statewide, especially in Eastern Washington, what talking points do you find work in conveying the value of advancing Black homeownership for board members and other stakeholders, such as elected officials, coming from a more conservative lens where a social justice argument may not hold as much weight, such as in places like Spokane County, Walla Walla, Yakima, etc.?
Great question. And I'll just jump in by saying that, I think of this in terms of the classroom in a sense that, some of us may be familiar. My wife happens to work in education, that, when we talk about English language learners, if the classroom is oriented to making sure that those incredible learners have every opportunity to learn, well, guess what? Everybody in the classroom seems to do a lot better, right? So if we think in terms of increasing Black home ownership in places where maybe there are a few less Black folk, we know that those efforts have a ripple effect and that it can really help the wider community, as it were. So a lot of these strategies, right, can be applicable to other populations that maybe lag in home ownership. And we know that the winning argument in my mind is we increase home ownership for folks across the board. You create communities where good things tend to happen. And I reflect back again on these redlining maps that are indicative of most metropolitan areas across the United States. You look at currently today where there's maybe a little less opportunity, a little less access to education, healthcare disparities, all of these things. Well, guess what? They reflect the same doggone redlining maps that were in place all those many years ago. So we know this. We know what the lack of opportunity does. And so let's create an argument where we say that let's create a challenge that we can meet because it has a positive effect on the wider community. I think that's a really good place to start the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Darryl. Does anybody else want to add anything to Darryl's response to that question? At this point, there are no more other questions. So if you want to say more on that, we have time.
So I can just build on Darryl's points around wealth building, especially. I think all communities across America just know that home ownership is one path to wealth building. For all of us, whatever race you are, we have used we have used home ownership as a wealth building tool. And just talking about how if we're all doing better, we're all better off. If the Black households have access to that wealth building tool that any white family has access to, we're all better off as a community. And I think it's important to always emphasize that for folks who may not see the social justice lens and the value of this work.
Thank you so much. So I think with that, we have just about 2 minutes until the session is going to end. We're all going to be probably automatically whisked back to the main room for the next, I think there's a plenary after us. So I just want to thank everybody so much. Thank you, our speakers, for your leadership, for your time and efforts, not just today, but for the duration of this effort thus far. I, for one, am really excited to see how this strategy plan turns into an action plan and, start rolling up our sleeves and getting going. And I just want to say one more time to everyone who joined this session today, you are more than welcome to join us. And we have our next joint session on November 5th. I also put the link to the document that has the strategy plan in it into the chat one more time. So you may want to go there before we leave today so you can download that and look at it more closely. Please do get in touch, and we'd love to have you participate in this work and look forward to adding many more partners and increase the number of Black homeowners in Puget Sound area and statewide. And closing that gap. So thanks again to our wonderful speakers and to everyone who joined today. Have a great rest of your Housing Washington conference. Take care.